Despite having found refuge in the depths of the forest and establishing their dominion among the shadows, the vampires began to feel a restlessness. It was a silent yet irresistible call, seeming to come from far beyond the trees and mountains. It wasn't a voice, nor a sound, but a deep pulse, like the echo of something ancient whispering directly into their minds. Something was calling to them, something powerful, and none of them could ignore it. The sensation was as visceral as the hunger that had once nearly driven them mad. It was as though their bodies, now freed from mortal limitations, were being drawn by a force beyond comprehension, a force that promised answers to questions they didn't even know they had. There was a familiarity in the call, but also a mystery. What or who was calling them? An ally, an enemy, or something far beyond either? They gathered at the foot of an ancient tree, its canopy veiling the moon like a shroud. The wolves surrounded them in silence, sensing the imminent change. No words were spoken, for they all knew what needed to be done. The forest, with all its vastness and secrets, was no longer enough. The promise of the unknown pushed them beyond what they had once considered their domain. Their departure was not a farewell, but an inevitable transition. The wolves, loyal to the end, followed them, moving like living shadows as the vampires crossed the boundaries of their territory for the first time since their transformation. The wind felt different beyond the forest, carrying unfamiliar scents and energies, but also the confirmation that the call grew stronger with each step forward. The world beyond the trees revealed itself as vast and strange. Open plains stretched under the silver light, and distant mountains rose like walls against the horizon. Each step carried them further from the home they had built, but closer to the origin of that enigmatic call. Even without knowing their exact destination, they felt every movement was guided by a force they couldn't comprehend, yet dared not question. During the journey, their immortal senses sharpened further. They could feel time flowing differently, as though the universe itself conspired to propel them forward. The nights grew more intense, and the days, even as they remained hidden from the light, brought vivid dreams filled with visions they couldn't fully understand. Nebulous silhouettes, towers touching the skies, and an ancient power seemed to call to them, not just for what they had become, but for what they could be. The landscape shifted as they advanced. Dense forests gave way to windswept fields, and the stars above seemed brighter and closer, as if they too were observing the journey. The wolves remained vigilant, but no signs of danger emerged. It was as though the world itself respected their passage, recognizing in them the mark of something that transcended mortality. The vampires, united in purpose, felt the distance between themselves and the source of the call diminish. Each night the call grew stronger, clearer, like a drumbeat marking the rhythm of their steps. They didn't know how long it would take or what awaited them at the end. But there was no hesitation. The forest had been a home, but it was not the final destination. The call was a challenge, an opportunity, and guided by the darkness and the pull of the unknown, they pressed on, determined to unravel the mystery awaiting them on the horizon. They walked, their pale figures moving like shadows among the cliffs, gliding silently, shaped by eternity and endless nights. The vampires found a solitary refuge, a space where their immortal existences needed no concealment, but where loneliness echoed even louder. The heights brought a paradoxical sense of freedom and confinement. The open, infinite night sky whispered promises of vastness, while the steep and uneven terrain tethered them to the weight of the earth. They were free to wander icy peaks and valleys shrouded in mist, yet never free to escape themselves. Immortality made them a part of the eternal landscape, as fixed as the mountains they climbed. In the deepest hours of the night, they paused to watch the world below. From these heights, human settlements appeared as distant flickering lights, insignificant against the vastness of the darkness. They observed those tiny lives with a mixture of disdain and longing, remembering when they too belonged to that fragile, pulsing world. But now their hearts beat to a different rhythm, an eternal rhythm, unbound by the laws of mortal time. The icy wind was a constant companion, whipping against their pale faces and carrying with it the scent of distant forests. It seemed to speak in an ancient tongue, understood only by the creatures of the night. Some stopped to listen, tilting their heads as if absorbing every sound, every whisper of the surrounding nature. The solitude was immense, yet the mountains whispered to them, offering a subtle comfort that only immortals could perceive. Among the peaks, they found dark caves that became their temporary shelters. There, where daylight could never reach, they rested, protected by layers of stone that seemed to guard them like old friends. The caves were cold and damp, but to them they offered a peace that even the vastness of the night could not provide. Some carved marks into the walls, forgotten symbols that told stories of solitude and memory. The silence of the mountains was absolute, yet it carried weight. Every step they took echoed like the sound of eternity. Some wandered as if searching for something, a purpose, an answer. But the mountains did not easily yield their secrets. They only offered space to exist, far from mortal eyes and the complications of the human world. When the moon reached its zenith, casting its silver light over the snow-covered peaks, they stopped to gaze. In those moments, time seemed to unravel, and eternity felt almost tangible. There was no rush to their wandering, for there was no end to their journey. The mountains stood as silent witnesses to their existence, guarding the steps and stories of women who, though immortal, still sought something that even eternity could not provide. And so, night after night, they continued. Their silhouettes vanished among the cliffs, like shadows dancing on the horizon, while the wind carried the melody of their solitude. Far from human eyes, they walked, not in search of a destination, but simply to exist, bearing the weight and beauty of a life that would never end. The vampires advanced along the winding mountain trails, their footsteps as light as shadows, leaving the forest behind. The air grew thinner and colder with every step. The stones beneath their feet seemed to pulse with the same energy that drew them forward, and the call was no longer just a sensation. It was a steady rhythm, like the beating of an invisible heart echoing in the distance. The wolves accompanied them in silence, their paws steady on the treacherous cliffs. They weren't always present, but they appeared like specters on the darkest nights, their eyes glowing like embers amidst the mist. When they vanished, it was as though they were patrolling the invisible boundaries of the path, guided by the same instinct driving their mistresses. The environment grew increasingly hostile. Jagged rocks jutted from the earth like claws, and the biting winds seemed to whisper secrets in a forgotten language. Yet no obstacle deterred them. Their immortal bodies defied the elements, and their minds were fixed on a destination they did not yet understand. The mountains with their mist-shrouded peaks were both a challenge and a promise, a bridge between what they were and what they could become. The nights in the heights were different. The darkness felt thicker, as though something saturated it, making it almost tangible. The starry sky, once a source of comfort, now seemed watchful, each star an attentive eye observing their progress. Meanwhile, the call grew more intense, as if the mountains amplified its power, making it impossible to ignore. At times they paused, not out of fatigue, but for reasons inexplicable. It was as if the world around them wanted to reveal something. A stone marked with unknown symbols, an echo that seemed to form words, or even the faint sound of something reminiscent of laughter. Everything felt laden with meaning, though they didn't know how to interpret these signs. They only felt they were drawing closer. The wolves, when present, moved in absolute silence, as if they understood the gravity of the journey. They neither howled nor hunted, merely followed, their eyes fixed on the horizon. Their presence was a reminder that, even in the vast solitude of the mountains, the vampires were not alone. The animals, with their sharpened instincts, seemed to sense the destiny awaiting them. In the early hours of the morning, amidst the biting cold, something changed. The call, which had once seemed distant, became almost tangible. It was like an electric current coursing through their bodies, a sign that they were close to uncovering the mystery guiding them. The landscape began to shift as well, as if the very mountain had been shaped by hands beyond the realm of humanity. The vampires felt the intensity of the call reach its peak, as if the entire world had held its breath. The stars above seemed closer, brighter, as though they too wished to witness what was about to unfold. They pressed onward, each step imbued with purpose. What had once been doubt or mystery was now certainty. Something powerful awaited them, something that had chosen them. Their destiny was no longer in their hands but in the invisible force that guided them through the mountains. And so, high in the mountains, with the wolves watching from afar and the call roaring silently within them, the vampires continued. The wolves, when present, moved in absolute silence, as if they understood the gravity of the journey. They neither howled nor hunted, merely followed, their eyes fixed on the horizon. Their presence was a reminder that, even in the vast solitude of the mountains, the vampires were not alone. The animals, with their sharpened instincts, seemed to sense the destiny awaiting them. In the early hours of the morning, amidst the biting cold, something changed. The call, which had once seemed distant, became almost tangible. It was like an electric current coursing through their bodies, a sign that they were close to uncovering the mystery guiding them. The landscape began to shift as well, as if the very mountain had been shaped by hands beyond the realm of humanity. The vampires felt the intensity of the call reach its peak, as if the entire world had held its breath. The stars above seemed closer, brighter, as though they too wished to witness what was about to unfold. They pressed onward, each step imbued with purpose. What had once been doubt or mystery was now certainty. Something powerful awaited them, something that had chosen them. Their destiny was no longer in their hands but in the invisible force that guided them through the mountains. And so, high in the mountains, with the wolves watching from afar and the call roaring silently within them, the vampires continued. The mountains were both a refuge and a stage for the vampires, a domain where their immortal bodies were unbound. As they trod the uneven trails, every stone beneath their feet seemed to awaken a primordial euphoria within them. The wind, stripping twisted trees bare and sweeping through the ravines, was not a nuisance. It was a wild embrace caressing their cold skin, a reminder of their invulnerability. They walked with feline grace, moving like living shadows between cliffs and slopes. The vastness around them was intoxicating. Each peak they reached offered a new vista, a panorama where the night sky seemed to descend and touch them. The stars gleamed like scattered jewels, while the moon, solitary and watchful, stood as their only witness. The immensity of the mountains did not diminish them. On the contrary, it made them feel even more alive, deeply connected to the raw force of that untouched landscape. The thrill also came from the sensation of being above the mortal world. There, miles from any village or human gaze, there were no rules but those they dictated themselves. Solitude, which for others might be oppressive, became a luxury, an infinite space to explore without haste. Every step seemed to feed the energy pulsing within them. The darkness of the mountains was no obstacle, but an ally. Their eyes pierced through the veil of shadows, capturing details others would miss. The subtle marks on the rocks, the movement of small animals in the snow, and even the flow of air currents winding through the valleys. There was a primal pleasure in defying the treacherous terrain. They scaled steep slopes with ease, their bodies unbothered by danger. At times, one of them would pause at the edge of a cliff, arms outstretched, as if to absorb the ancestral power of the mountains. It was a gesture overflowing with strength and desire, a silent acknowledgement that those heights were as wild and eternal as they themselves were. The mist, moving like a living shroud, did not blind them but seemed to dance around them, inviting and mysterious. There was something almost ritualistic about traversing that landscape, as though every step was a vow of loyalty to the untamed forces of nature. And in the distance, the echo of their movements across the mountains seemed to respond, a distant whisper that said, "You belong to this place." The intense cold, which would freeze the life out of any other, was a frosty caress on their skin. They smiled at one another, a hungry glint in their eyes as they climbed higher, ever closer to the stars. The altitude seemed to intoxicate them, filling their bodies with an energy that went beyond hunger or the instinct for survival. It was something deeper, an exhilaration born of the understanding that here, in this vast and untamed expanse, they were truly free. And so, they continued to walk through the mountains with a mixture of joy and reverence, as if each step made them more a part of that world and less of the shadows they once inhabited. Each night, the heights called them back, and they answered, eager to once again feel the wild magic of the mountains that, in some way, shared their immortality. Amid the cutting winds of the mountains, the vampires walked in silence. Their steps left no trace on the dense snow, and their long, unnecessary breaths did not form clouds in the icy air. They were wrapped in their own thoughts, their minds steeped in the shadows of a solitude that seemed to be all that remained. The landscape was inhospitable, with jagged cliffs and ravines that gaped below them like hungry mouths. Yet the vampires moved with supernatural grace, as though they were an extension of that ancient, wild terrain. The moon, shy behind a thin veil of clouds, cast a silvery glow over the frozen peaks, lighting the tortuous path they followed with no apparent destination. It was only when the night had reached its peak that something different caught their attention. In the distance, at the edge of their keen vision, a structure began to emerge from the hazy horizon. At first, it was indistinct, almost blending with the natural shapes of the mountains. But as they drew closer, its contours became clearer. It seemed to be an ancient construction, built so long ago that its origins might well predate mortal legends. Dark, weathered towers rose against the sky, while massive walls disappeared partially into the mist shrouding its base. The structure seemed as much a part of the landscape as it was something that defied its nature. A remnant of a forgotten time, yet still pulsing with a hidden power. The vampires paused briefly, exchanging silent glances. They didn't need words to share the same thought. This was no ordinary structure. The air around them seemed to hum with the weight of something ancient and deeply significant, as if the very wind carried echoes of a force slumbering within those walls. Without hesitation, they began to approach, each step more cautious than the last. The structure seemed to grow larger with every moment, as if it had a life of its own, expanding before their eyes. The darkness surrounding the towers was thicker, almost repelling the faint light of the moon, and the silence, once natural, now felt oppressive, a heavy shroud enveloping their senses. Still, they were drawn to it, an invisible force pulling them like silent chains. They did not know whether what awaited them would be welcoming or hostile, but the sense of inevitability guided them forward. Something about that structure resonated with their immortal natures, awakening memories they hadn't known they possessed. It was as if a fragment of their history, forgotten in the folds of time, was about to be unveiled. As they approached, they began to notice details that had been hidden by distance. Arches adorned with incomprehensible symbols, stones that faintly glimmered under the moonlight, and a massive door of dark wood, slightly ajar, as if offering a silent invitation. Whatever this structure guarded, it seemed to have been waiting for them for a very long time. The mist-shrouded mountains rose like slumbering giants, their shadowy curves dissolving into the dense veil, embracing the horizon. The vampires walked in silence, their slender silhouettes moving with supernatural fluidity. Their eyes glowed like embers beneath the faint light of the moon, each step echoing softly against the rocky, snow-covered ground. The journey was long, and then, as the fog began to part for a brief moment, the vision finally unveiled itself. A monumental castle rested atop a hill. The structure was immense, its dark towers rising toward the sky like claws reaching for the stars. Ancient walls encircled the castle, but even the passage of centuries had failed to diminish the majesty of its presence. Its severe and grand contours seemed framed by the mist surrounding it, making it almost ethereal, as if it belonged to a dream or a distant memory. The vampires stopped, their figures motionless before the sight. The silence was broken only by the whistling wind, but none of them needed to speak. They knew without a doubt that the castle was more than a shelter. It was a call, a destiny. Something awaited them there, something that seemed to understand the darkness within their hearts and the eternity flowing through their veins. As they resumed their path toward the hill, the structure seemed to grow, as if coming to life with every step they took closer. Its details slowly revealed themselves. Narrow windows like watchful eyes, iron doors adorned with ancient, incomprehensible runes, and towers that seemed to whisper forgotten stories carried by the wind. It was impossible to determine who had built such a fortress, but it exuded an aura of power, both welcoming and foreboding. Even so, none of them hesitated. The solitude of the mountains faded behind them, and before them, the castle became a symbol of a new beginning. They knew the road leading there had been merely the prelude to something greater, something waiting for them in the depths of that fortress forgotten by time. Without looking back, the vampires crossed the final stretch of the path, vanishing into the mist that cloaked the surroundings. And then all that remained was the silence of the mountains and the echo of a wind that seemed to mourn the departure of its nocturnal travelers.